Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Peter Holland. I'm Associate Dean for the Arts in College of Arts and Letters, and it's my genuine delight every year to organise and present the Saturday Scholars Lectures. Today's lecturer, Cindy Bergeman, is somebody who has actually been at Notre Dame ever since she finished her PhD, which of course was just the year before last. She has been here for some time and has held not only a series of positions within the Department of Psychology, but has also been a great servant of the university. She has been in the college, the director for the Institute for Scholarship in the Liberal Arts and Associate Dean of Research. She spent 6 years as chair of the Department of Psychology, and as any of us who have been chair of any department know, that's a really a period of hard labour. And currently, she is an Associate Vice President for Research, working in the University's Office for Research on Research Compliance. Her own research, which obviously she's going to talk about, clearly provides us with the ideal takeaway. And I promise that if you remember nothing else from this talk, you will remember that stress is indeed dessert spelled backward. Her own research concentrates on the interplay among stress and resilience mechanisms and health and well-being outcomes in young, middle-aged, and older adults. You can decide which of those categories you fall in. The goal of her work is to understand why some individuals age more successfully than others. And she has succeeded over years of getting many substantial research grants from the National Institute of Aging. I'm delighted to welcome Cindy to talk about how stress gets under the skin, implications for health and well-being. Cindy.
Can you hear me? Yes. All right, great. So, the first step is, how many of you know implicitly what this means? All right, show of hands. How many people never have enough time in their day to get everything done that they intended to do? How many of you have jumped or felt your heart race when you were startled by something? How many of you have had clammy hands when you're at a social event and you didn't really know anyone? How many of you have gotten goosebumps when you're walking down a dark street at night and you hear footsteps behind you? And you just know it's going to be a creeper. How many of you felt kind of sick to your stomach when you had to do something that you really didn't want to do, like give somebody bad news? How many of you guys have felt jittery and on edge when you're watching Notre Dame football? And you're behind by 3, and the ball's on the 20-yard line, and there's 7 seconds left on the clock. All right, so how many of you felt stressed? Okay, my work here is done. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about different characteristics of stress. I want to talk about why stress is a problem for our health and to make some connections for you. I'm probably not going to say anything that you haven't heard before, but often thinking about it and thinking about it in the context of stress and health is really beneficial for all of us. So stress is the degree to which individuals appraise their situations as being unpredictable, uncontrollable, or they just feel like they're overloaded. But there are some different types of stress. The first one we call acute stress. Acute stress comes and goes fairly quickly. We're driving down the road, a car runs a red light or a stoplight, and it's that response that we have when we're trying to avoid an accident. Chronic stress is the stress that I think is most interesting. It comes from stress responses when either we have multiple stressors or our stress is chronic in such a way that we never can quite return back to our baseline. This type of stress comes from jobs that we don't like. It could come from difficult or complicated relationships that we have, overpacked schedules, financial difficulties, etc. But one of the questions that we don't often think about is all stress bad? There's actually eustress. Eustress is the good stress. It's considered that for a reason. It helps to keep us feeling vital, feeling alive, and excited about living. So if we look at the relationship between our overall performance and our level of stress, it is what we call a curvilinear relationship. That is, stress has an important role in our lives. It pushes us to make necessary changes. It may push us to complete those assignments that we just need to get done. It can enhance our performance. So we can think about the athletes out on the field today. A feeling of stress can have a positive influence because it can increase their speed, their agility, their acuity. Stress can also signal when we're in danger and help inspire us to action, to kind of get ourselves out of that difficult situation. So in this way, feelings of stress and even anxiety is healthy. It's necessary. Without that, we might not act in our own best interest. But how much is actually too much? The point at which our worry or our stress becomes unhealthy is when it stops pushing us to act. Because we're worried about something that's not under our control, or we're worried about things that haven't even happened yet, or because we're just immobilized and we don't feel like we can be inspired to act. So let's look at what the acute stress process looks like. How many of you have heard of the notion of fight or flee? So the acute stress response that we see has an evolutionary benefit. It occurs when we face some type of an environmental demand or stressor. It could be physical, it could be psychological, and the sympathetic nervous system begins to activate a variety of neurological, metabolic, immune, and cardiovascular systems. So we see increased blood flow to our muscles. They become tense, they become ready for action. Our heart starts to beat faster, our blood pressure goes up, again, getting us ready for peak exertion. We start breathing more rapidly so we can get oxygen and blood to our muscles. We may feel like we need to urinate or empty our bowels. This is going to make us lighter so that we can run faster. There's kind of a joke, you don't need to paint the barn, that is build physical resources, when there's a tornado bearing down on you. So our digestion stops, the blood is diverted from the gut to the arms and legs. There are specific hormones that are released. Those make our blood very sticky so that if we're injured, we're less likely to lose blood. We start to sweat. That does two things. It helps cool us off during peak exertion. Also, if we're a zebra on the savannah being chased by a lion, it makes us a little bit more slippery when they try to catch us. And then there's also changes in our sensations and our perceptions. Sometimes we have this feeling that things are moving in slow motion or things have slowed down. So this is the process that occurs during this sort of fight or flee response that we have. So we've got these environmental demands, and the first step of the process is we have to appraise this stressor, and we have to think about what our capacity to deal with it is. So one aspect of stress is it's in the eye of the beholder. You know, someone might tell you that they're very stressed, and you might think, well, that's really not that big of a deal. But if I feel like I'm stressed, that has detrimental implications for my health. So for example, stressors that people talk about is getting up and speaking in front of people. Some people find that extremely stressful, other people not so much. So the first step is thinking about whether or not the individual even views the situation as being stressful. If they don't, then it will return to sort of our natural set. So again, this idea that we're walking down the street alone at night, we hear these footsteps behind us, we have this stress response, we turn around, it's not a creeper, it's a friend of ours running up behind us to catch up with us, and our stress response returns back to what we call homeostasis. But we can also perceive the situation as being stressful. And when we do that, we have a negative emotional response that is associated with that stress, and we have the physiological activation or response that I just told you about. So what happens? Well, we can engage our resilience mechanisms, our coping strategies. We're going to talk about some of those today. And if we do a good job with that, again, we can return our physiological arousal back to its normal state. Sometimes the stressor just ends, and again, we can return to what we call homeostasis. But the real question is this extended activation. That is these stressors that don't go away, and they can have secondary effects on our health. So we begin to see increases in people's blood pressure if they have chronic stress, increases in glucose levels, changes in immune capacity, and we see some characteristic differences in what we call waist-to-hip ratio. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. And then, if this process sort of goes unabated, we begin to see some of the health outcomes: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, depression, some cognitive decline. Now, it's not the case that everybody's diabetes occurs because of a stress response. There are genetic influences on that. It's complicated, but we do see these very clear linkages between high levels of stress and some of these more specific health outcomes. So we have our stressor, we have the stress response, we have our coping response, and then we have these stress outcomes that we can begin to think about. So let's think about stress. It may seem like there is nothing that you can do about your stress level. Not only is this poor guy having to do his job on national television, how many would like to do their job on national television? Now, I'll do it in front of you, but national television, thank you, but no. You know, he is counting on young players and, dare I say, fair roughing. On game day, so many things are no longer under his control. For those of us who are sort of working behind the scenes, and we're thinking, I need to really put my own picture together, or maybe a little mirror so that you can see yourself in the middle of that slide. You know, if our stress is financial, our bills aren't going to stop coming. There are never going to be more hours in the day to get done all of the things that you need to do. And, you know, your career, your family responsibilities, those things are always going to be demanding. But you actually do have a lot more control over your stress than you think. You know, just the simple realization that you're in control of your life is really the foundation for stress management. So stress management is all about taking charge. Taking charge of your thoughts, taking charge of your emotions, your schedule, your environment, and the way that you deal with problems. And the ultimate goal is really to have a balanced life. That it is to have enough time for work, enough time for your relationships, time for relaxation, some time for fun, and then to have the resilience to be able to hold up under pressure and meet the challenges that you have head on. So let's start thinking about how you currently cope with stressful situations and the way in which you manage these. So a lot of us like to let our friends Ben and Jerry help us out on a stressful day with that great container of ice cream. We get to a point we don't even get a bowl out, we straight from the carton. Or we might want to have a glass of wine to help us relax. But if eating the wrong things becomes our main coping mechanism, or if one glass of wine turns into 4 or 5 glasses of wine, that certainly is going to compound the situation. What makes this more complicated is the primary stress hormone is cortisol. And you get, during stress, you get elevated levels of cortisol, and you have what we call cortisol cravings. So cortisol's job is to get your body ready for the next stressor. And so if you're chronically stressed, it's trying to always have your body prepared to deal with that adversity. So it wants to do 2 things. It wants to increase your blood pressure, and it wants to increase your glucose levels. So these cortisol cravings are cravings for sweet and salty snacks. And the other piece of that is that it wants to store that excess glucose in your belly fat because it can access it much more quickly during times of stress. So I mentioned before that you begin to see changes in people's waist to hip ratio. That is, the waist gets bigger relative to the hips, and because you're seeing this characteristic storing of the glucose in the fat of the belly. So it is important to eat a healthy diet, to be well nourished. It's going to help you be better prepared to cope with stress. So we do need to be mindful of what we eat. Not to say, don't eat sweet and salty snacks, but you need to be aware when you're under stress that physiologically your body is craving that, and can you look for alternatives? Multitudes of people enjoy coffee intake. Certainly it's evidenced by the fact that we have Starbucks really, or other coffee houses on almost every corner. Again, although the occasional coffee isn't going to do you any great harm, and I'm always listening to the evidence that says it can actually be beneficial. You hear what you want to hear, and as they zigzag back and forth, I always say, but yes, but there is evidence that shows it's beneficial. It is possible that you can have a full-blown caffeine addiction. So we do need to be aware of how much caffeine you get. These temporary highs from caffeine often end in a crash, both in mood and energy. You know, a lot of us talk about, you need coffee to get going in the morning and to keep going, and then you drink too much coffee, and that interferes with your ability to sleep. Then you don't sleep well, and then you need coffee to sort of kickstart you again. It becomes a vicious cycle. Although I joke, the only time caffeine keeps me awake at night is when my husband drinks it. Because then it's tossing and turning, and that is in fact what keeps me awake. So, we hear all the time, exercise, exercise, exercise. I'm actually kind of allergic to exercise. I like exercise that's very well disguised in something fun. But exercise is really important. And the reason why it's important is when you're under stress, your body is geared up to fight or flee. You have this physiological response. So one way to break that link between this stress, fight, or flee response and potential health outcomes is to dissipate that physiological arousal. So if your body gears up to fight or flee because of stress, and you exercise, you're dissipating that arousal. So at least maybe you haven't gotten rid of your stress, but you've diminished or modified its ability to have a detrimental effect on your health. We can also do this with yoga or meditation or prayer. What we really want to do is look at ways to silence that arousal that is occurring, these relaxation techniques. Because it's the physiological arousal of stress that results in the health problems. Another thing we want to do is just make sure that we get enough sleep. Sleep is something that we're learning much more about, has very important implications for our long-term health. Interestingly, in a lot of our research, we'll ask people how much sleep they get at night, and a lot of people will say, I get 8 hours of sleep, because that's kind of what we have in our mind. But if you ask them, when they regularly go to bed, and when they regularly get up, they don't even get close to 8 hours of sleep. And so we get this sleep debt that builds up and can cause a lot of health-related problems. So that's some of the physiological things that we can do, but I'm a psychologist. I want to focus on some of the things that we can do to help us deal with the actual stressors that we experience in our life. Stress management really starts with identifying the sources of stress. And we think that that's actually quite easy to do, but this may be one of the most difficult things. So for example, we might blame our boss because we think they're overly critical or they have these high expectations that we're going to get this work done, when in fact we're a bit of a procrastinator and we haven't done the things that we need to do, and then we have time pressure, we're trying to do them at the last minute, and we're blaming our boss for something that perhaps we need to take ownership of. A lot of times people will just explain away their stress as being temporary. I've just got a million things going on right now. Sometimes we define stress as just part of our work or home life. Things are just kind of crazy around here. Or even as our personality. So we might have a lot of nervous energy or something like that. But what we want to do is keep in mind that we play a role in creating and maintaining our levels of stress. So, a great idea is to avoid all stress. Not all stress can be avoided, and it's not healthy to avoid a situation that needs to be addressed. But you might be surprised by the number of stressors in your life that you can actually eliminate. The first one is you need to learn how to say no. You need to know what your limits are, and you need to stick to them. Taking on more than you can handle is a surefire recipe for having stress. You need to avoid people who stress you out. So if someone consistently causes you stress and you can't turn that relationship around, you need to try to limit the amount of time that you're spending with that individual. Maybe that individual is your spouse or your mother or your child. Maybe it's not reasonable to do that, but the extent to which, you've got relationships that are causing difficulty, you need to try to better manage those. And the third piece is to really pare down your to-do list. So we need to kind of look at how much time we have, what our tasks are, and if we feel like we have too much on our plate, we need to be able to look at the things that we should do and separate those from the things that we must do. So a lot of times we take on tasks that we think we should do when we in fact don't have to do them. So it may be that we need to put things that aren't absolutely necessary down at the bottom of our list or eliminate them altogether. So organizing, making lists, prioritizing things certainly helps you gain more control over sort of what seems to be an overextended list of tasks to do. If you can't avoid a stressful situation, then you might try to alter it. Figure out what you can do so that the problem doesn't present itself. Often this involves changing the way you communicate with people. So maybe you need to express your feelings rather than just letting them build up. If someone's bothering you, you really need to communicate that concern, because the resentment that builds up with the situation is just going to aggravate it. And you need to be willing to compromise. So if you're asking other people to change their behavior, you need to be willing to do the same. Try to find a happy middle ground. You also need to be more assertive. So don't take a back seat in your own life. Deal with the problems that you have, deal with them head on, try to anticipate, and prevent problems. And kind of related to this is just managing your time better. I think poor time management causes a lot of stress. If we feel like we're stretched too thin, it's really hard to stay calm, be focused, planning ahead, not overextending ourselves is certainly the best way to alter that stressful situation. If you can't change the stressor, then you need to try to change yourself. So you can adapt to a stressor, regain more of a sense of control by changing your expectations or changing your attitudes. So one thing you can do is reframe the problem in a more positive way. Rather than fuming because you're in a traffic jam, look at it as an opportunity to listen to your favorite music on the radio or have some alone time. Try to look at the bigger picture of things. Ask yourself, is this a problem? Will it matter a week from now, a month from now, a year from now? So for example, one of the biggest stressors in an adolescent's life is whether or not they have a date for the prom. And that is, it's the end of the world if you don't have a date for the prom. How many of you ever had to put the name of your date for the prom on a college application, a job application, anything like that? So again, it's a question, does it matter in the bigger picture of things? Is it something that's so important that I need to spend all of this energy and time dealing with it? Sometimes we have to adjust our standards. Sometimes the problem is that we're a perfectionist. We're not willing to finish a task until it's absolutely perfect. Doesn't really apply to me, but some people have that problem. And what you really need to do is you need to try to set reasonable standards for yourself and for other people, and there needs to be things that maybe need to be perfect, but there are other things that can be good enough. And then it's just really important to focus on the positive. When we're really feeling stressed, we need to take a moment just to reflect on the things that we appreciate about our lives. Maybe some of our positive qualities that we have, some of our gifts and talents. This simple strategy can really help us to keep things in perspective. So beyond kind of this take charge approach, having a positive attitude, we can also reduce stress in our life by trying to nurture ourselves better. We need to make time for fun and relaxation. We're going to be in a much better place to handle stressful situations when they come. So this idea of nurturing ourselves, it's a necessity. It's not a luxury. So we need to spend time connecting with other people who enhance our life. Strong support system is really important in helping you to modify the negative effects of stress. We also need to keep our sense of humor. The ability not only to laugh at ourselves, but the act of laughing itself helps to dissipate that physiological arousal. You need to do something that you enjoy every single day. You need to make time for leisure activities that bring you joy. Whether it's gazing at the stars, playing the piano, working on your bicycle, you need to set aside time for yourself. So it's this idea that self-care really isn't selfish. You can't serve from an empty vessel. So can't stress this enough. We often give ourselves to everyone else, but we often forget to take care of ourselves. Some of the sources of our stress are just unavoidable. We can't prevent or change stressors such as the death of a loved one, getting a serious illness, having a national recession. In such cases, the best way is to just accept things as they are. Acceptance might be difficult, but in the long run, it's easier than continuing to try to rail against a situation that you can't change. So don't try to control situations that are uncontrollable, especially the behavior of other people. So rather than stressing out over them, we need to focus on things that we can control, such as the way we choose to react to a particular problem. We need to always try to look at the upside. You know, they say what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Facing these major challenges and trying to look at them as challenges or opportunities for development and growth and not threats is also really important. A lot of times helping other people, that is giving of yourself, you know, put your own life stress or your own situations into a larger perspective. Not only does it make you feel better about yourself to help someone else, but someone always has a worse, more difficult situation than you do. And finally, it's important to learn to forgive. We do need to accept the fact that we live in an imperfect world, and all people make mistakes. So we need to let go of our anger and our resentments. We need to free ourselves from negative energy by forgiving and moving on. I don't want to talk a lot in this talk about the search per se, but I want to give you just a little flavor of the type of work that we do. So we're really interested in this idea of stress. And I'm interested, my main interest is older adults. I've kind of moved backwards across the lifespan. But I'm really interested in what people identify as being the most stressful life event, and that is the loss of a spouse. So the Notre Dame Widowhood Study came about because when you talk with older adults, they talk about sort of the emotional aftermath of losing a spouse. Is like being on a roller coaster. Sometimes it's pretty good, but then you just plummet, and then you come back up and you plummet. So we were really interested in this kind of non-linear sort of emotion system. So one of the areas that I focus on is emotion. Our emotion systems are more wave-like. So some people might have this kind of wave, some people might have this kind of wave, some people's wave might be up here, much more positive overall, some people's might be down here. But the idea was that we wanted to see whether or not we could model the emotional regulation response that people experience following the loss of the spouse. So we wanted to know what this initial process of recovery looked like. That is, how do people re-regulate after a trauma? And we wanted to identify the factors that were importantly involved in this process. So the way the study was set up is that we invited recent widows into our study, and we interviewed them, and we're psychologists, we asked them to complete a series of questions. And then we randomly assigned them to one of two groups. Some of our widows went into what we're calling the experimental group. That is, we asked them every evening before they went to bed to complete a short list of questions that ask them about their daily stressors, their grief resolution, their emotional experiences. And then we had what we called a control group. We treated them the same way, but they didn't do the daily data. And then at the end of those 98 days, we interviewed them again. They filled out another series of questionnaires for us. And then we followed them. At 8 months, 12 months, 16 months, 20 months, and then at 2, 3, 4, and 5 years. So we wanted to look not only what the immediate process looked like, but we also wanted to know what it looked like across a longer span of time. So one of the things that is really cool about the psychology department at Notre Dame is it has a world-class quantitative program. This is a program that not only is very good at statistics, systems analysis comes out of fluid physics, but it's a very nice technique to be able to overlay complex behaviors. So there are two types of components to a dynamic system. One is called the order parameters, and those are internal to the system. And we're also going to talk about in a minute what's called control parameters, and those are outside of the system, but they involve and influence characteristics of these internal parameters. So what do I mean by all of this? So what we talked about was the way in which someone's emotional response following the loss of a spouse looked like a roller coaster. So there are some characteristics of this trajectory that we can examine. We can look at the amplitudes, we can look at how high are people's highs, how low are their lows. We can look at the frequency, we can look at how quickly they oscillate from sort of positive to negative emotions. We can, sorry, I'm really unable to function on that. We can look at damping, that's how quickly do they return. So if you think about this model like a pendulum with friction, we've got a pendulum that swings back and forth. We add force to that, it starts swinging much more wildly, but eventually it returns to its steady state. We're thinking the same thing about emotions. Someone's emotions are going along, they have a major life event, they lose their spouse, that perturbs the system, their emotions swing much more wildly, but they eventually sort of return those to a steady state. And then the fourth thing we can look at is the overall trend. That is, generally speaking, we know that widows look better 3 months later than they did slightly after the loss of the spouse. So what did we find? We found that there was not a significant difference between people in terms of the amplitude of the effect. There was... It is a stressor. Not that I'm really doing anything about it. We did see that there was a significant trend, so people varied in sort of how much they improved or didn't improve over that 3-month period. There was a significant difference in frequency. Some people oscillated much more quickly than other people did. And there was a significant effect for this damping, how long it took people to re-regulate their emotions after this experience. So I talked a little bit about order and control parameters. These control parameters are external, so these things I just described are internal to the system. Control parameters are external, but they could influence people's frequency or damping or trend. So one of the things that I'm just going to put this down. One of the things that we looked at was this idea of social support. So one of the things, it might not surprise anybody to learn that having a strong support network helps people deal with adversity. You should also keep in mind that people's support network may in fact be the source of their adversity, but that's a separate question. So we were really interested in what are the effects of characteristics of people's social support network on the characteristics of this emotion regulation system. So social support is complicated, so we asked people whether or not they had social support. And it's the case that you can have one person, so you have a small network, but the quality of that relationship is extraordinary. Or it's possible that you can have 10 or 15 people in your support network, but none of them are really all that helpful. So it's not only the size of the network, but really the quality of that network that is also important. In addition to that, it's important as to whether or not you feel like you have control over your social support. So if you want somebody to do something for you, do you feel like you have the efficacy to make that happen? And actually use it. So people might have a strong social support network, but they don't cope using social support. And we can look at social coping as it relates to emotion-focused coping, which is people who can give you sympathy and empathy and care, and problem-focused coping, people who can actually solve the problems that you might be experiencing. So what do we find? We found that perceiving that you have control over your social network, and also that this more emotion-focused coping strategy, that is people who care about you and tend you when you need it, predicted who looked better at the end of the 3-month period. So people who had much steeper trajectories, improved more across the 3 months, were people who felt like they had control over their social network, and there were people who were providing them with support. Individuals that had someone who would help them to actually solve their problems predicted this damping parameter. That is, it predicted how quickly people could sort of rein that emotion dysregulation that was caused by the loss of the spouse back into more typical or normal bounds. So basically what the study showed was that we can model something that's complex, like the emotional dysregulation that occurs after a major stressor, that there are individual differences in what that process looks like. So again, that people experience their stressors in ways that are very different. And then the aspects of social support during this bereavement process really were good predictors of why people regulated differently. So we've taken these ideas, have the study that I'm working on now, we have about 1,000 subjects in the study. We're in the 10th year of what we hope will be a 15-year study, looking at individual stress just in their day-to-day sorts of lives. So we've measured people every year across the 10-year period. Every other year we have them do these little diary bursts so we can look at people's lived experiences that they have. It may be that it's not those big major life events that we think about that has a negative impact on our health. It's really these day-to-day sorts of hassles that we have difficulty dealing with that is more likely the culprit. In addition to that, we bring people in, we get a health assessment on them, we capture people's daily cortisol, we get that from their saliva. So we're surfing the saliva, nothing better than saying, could I have some samples of your saliva? And people don't even spit on us. They say, yeah, sure. And so, we're really interested in trying to tie the physiological with the psychological so that we can better understand how these systems are acting in concert. So, for example, if we see sort of variability in people's sort of emotion regulation as a function of their daily stress, do we see sort of the concomitant influences in the cortisol patterns? That is the physiology telling us the same thing that the psychology or the perceptions are telling us? So when we begin to think about this process, Peter highlighted that I'm really interested in resilience resources. I'm interested in why do people age differently? Why is it that two people can experience the same negative life event and one person grows from that experience and the other person gives up, they get sick, they lose hope? What is it about individuals that can help us better understand why do some people flourish and other people don't? In learning more about these complex sorts of processes, we can begin then to better understand what needs to be done from an intervention or a prevention perspective. One thing that you need to keep in mind, though, is that living a successful life doesn't mean that you're living a life without adversity. It means that you've developed strategies that can help you cope with the stressors that we know you will experience across your life. And I'm hoping that it will not be stressful this evening when we're watching the football game. We can all just sit there and eat our popcorn because we will be had by 60 points. And we'll be able to put the cheerleaders on the field to, do the second half part. So here's to a stress-free evening for all of us. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have a question about your study. What the study that you did, do you have a timeline? Can you say, like, in general, can you quantify how long it took widows to get back, from this to more of a steady state?
We measured people for 3 months. When we started the study, we really didn't know how long we would need to measure them. Most of them had returned kind of to their steady state by about 2 months. But there was certainly variability, and some people really hadn't returned at the end of the 3-month period. We could have followed them longer. But about 2 months, roughly, the majority of people had re-regulated.
I thought you were studying them 15 years. Would you plan to study the same group?
The widows we studied for 5 years. But what I was reporting was the daily diaries that they provided us from shortly after the loss of their spouse for 98 days. So that was just the part I was reporting on. We have a second study that doesn't focus on any particular stressed group. It's just individuals that are community belonging that range in age from 18 to 93. There was a question in the back of that.
Yeah, any preliminary findings of the proposed 15-year study?
Lots and lots and lots of findings from that study. We've been able, again, to use more complex analytic techniques of people's day-to-day lived experience to kind of capture things like what we call stress dissipation. So that means that everybody sort of across we measure them for 56 days. So they have stress coming in, but their stress levels just don't increase unabated. People are getting rid of some of that stress. So again, we can use a modeling technique that allows us to capture the essence of who's better at bringing that stress level back down once they experience stress. So if you think about it as a water level in a reservoir, you have water coming in, but if the water's going back down, then you're actually more resilient than if you don't have all that much stress, but you're holding on to it. And we've been able to use that information to predict trajectories of depression, trajectories of health. We did a study where, and we can look at how that changes over time because we have multiple bursts. We have 7 bursts of data on people across that 10-year period. And then, just one other quick thing, and I'll grab it. We did another study where we were interested in religiousness and spirituality and the effects of that as a resilience resource. And so we looked at individuals, so we have their sort of day-to-day negative affect, their day-to-day levels of stress, and then their use of religious coping in that process. And we looked at the extent to which people use religious coping to decrease the effects of stress on daily negative affect, so we could capture that across the time series. We found that individuals who were better at that, had better metabolic function, they had lower A1C glucose levels, they had more favorable waist to hip ratio, better BMI scores, and then they also had better cholesterol and triglycerides. So again, showing that a mechanism, this resilience resource that people were using was modifying the effects of stress, and we saw better health outcomes because we're doing that. So those are the kinds of questions that we have been asking. There's a question. we're not sure that we have very good examples of what that process looks like, but I think it would be very different. Yeah.
Stress often creates anxiety, and anxiety today just seems to be a medication word for medication equals anxiety equals medication. Were there any of your participants who were on any kinds of medication versus using stress reduction health, natural health versus the medication?
Yeah, those, we do get information about their drug usage. At this point, we haven't integrated that information into the types of questions that we're asking, but that's certainly a really good point. If you are taking medication, and that is either making you feel better about the stress, or you've got a much higher stress level, and so you're taking the medication, that often just adds a lot of variability and, in essence, errors in what we're trying to do. So it makes the questions that we're asking more complicated to detect, but being able to include that in the equation. And in our longitudinal study, because we have a lot more people in that study, it's easier for us to add more of those characteristics. Yeah.
Did you correlate the type of death people may have experienced? A sudden death may cause more stress than, say, a slow death of cancer and cause different.
Yeah, we did. And there were differences. You're absolutely right. When you look at the grief process, if someone is dying from cancer, you have an opportunity to grieve actually prior to the death. So we did control for some of those attributes. There's a little bit of variability in how long it had been since the person died. I think we were trying to be gracious in inviting people into the study. So we also controlled for how long it had been since the actual death. So we looked at whether the death was seen as sudden, whether it was viewed as being sort of on time versus off time, which maybe is more psychological lingo. But are you at an age where you would expect to lose your spouse versus being much, much younger? And these effects can also be different. Yeah.
Do you plan in the future, Michael, chances to study death from narcotic overdose?
That would probably be much more specific than the types of questions that I've been asking and trying to answer. That may well be more in sort of the clinical arena of psychology. I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm much more interested in sort of normative development. But certainly all of the aspects, if someone dies in an accident versus not, the history, we looked at the quality of the relationship, all of those things are really important. Our focus is a little bit more now on more normative aging than just looking at the widows per se. Way in the back?
Me?
Yeah.
How did you recruit your participants from different regions of the country, or what methods did you?
Well, the large-scale study, we used a survey sampling company because we were interested in people from the 5-county region around here, because we wanted to be able to bring individuals into the lab to study them, get health evaluations and that type of thing on them. So we were geographically constrained by that. With the widowhood study, interestingly, I had a pre-law student. I thought this was a great job for a pre-law student, going through the obituaries and looking for people who had recently lost a spouse. Is that not good training for a law student? And then, we sent them a letter and just said, we're going to be contacting you. If you really don't want to talk to us, then you can leave, a message here. Be sure and tell us who you are. So, we're trying to be very conscientious about our approach to that. Did you have a follow-up question?
Do you think your colleagues on the East Coast and West Coast will say this is an atypical sample from the upper Midwest?
They certainly could do that. A lot of the research process is how generalizable is this information. We do have a sample that is, racial, ethnically fairly diverse, lots of variability in socioeconomic status. Do they represent the East Coast and the West Coast? Probably not. So, we have findings that you know, it would be great to partner with individuals in other areas to try to diversify that. So the answer is probably not. One more question.
Thanks.
One more question.
On the window study, I understand there's an experimental group and a control group, and the only difference was that the experimental group was providing daily data.
Yeah, so I sort of glossed over that.
Yeah.
The thinking was, if we're asking people about how well they're re-regulating their emotions, one of the things that we were worried about was that our methods would actually interfere with the process that we were interested in. So if I ask you to report on your emotions every evening, might that actually be an intervention that helps you regulate? So roughly speaking, I call it a control group. These people didn't do that, and we looked to see whether their adjustment overall was any
And
different.
did you find that?
There wasn't any difference.
Wow.
So good news, bad news is our method wasn't a problem. Bad news is that's not an intervention strategy that you can use.
Well, the call this afternoon is obviously go Irish, don't stress us. Thank you, Cecilia.
Maybe we should